We're back. In this video, I'm talking about how to make and handle a parchment pastry cone. If you didn't know this by now, you'll know it after this video, but I'm a no gadgets kind of girl. I do 99% of my decorating with this simple do-it-yourself tool. Parchment pastry cone, also known as a cornet. This tool I use for applying icing primarily, or piping as it's called. There are other tools that you can use to do this. Many bakers will work with a bag with a metal tip, but frankly I hate to use bags. I'll avoid them at all costs because they're very difficult to clean. At the end of the day, when I'm done with a parchment pastry cone, I simply cut off the tip, squeeze out the icing, and throw out the bag, whereas with this I have to uncouple it, take out the plastic piece that keeps the tip in place, and it's just a messy proposition. I also find that the plastic is a little bit harder to control. It's a little more floppy, and there's just a lot of mass of pastry bag to handle, so it affords me less control. It's just a little more clumsy to work with. You can also, and some people do, pipe with disposable plastic piping bags and just simply cut a hole across the tip. The issue with these bags, I find, and I don't know if you can see this up close, but they're always seamed on the edge. So if you were to simply cut across the top, you never get quite as nice a rounded line coming out of them. There's always some disruption by those seams that causes a slight funkiness to the line that you pipe. Again, they're plastic, they're also floppy, and they don't have quite the tension that the paper does, so I have less control with these. Another choice of some decorators are squeeze bottles. These can be fitted with metal tips to allow you some flexibility in terms of how you pipe, but again, very difficult to clean and much less control because as you lose volume here, there's just much less tension on the actual squeeze bottle than you might have with a bag. And it's important to have tension on the bag because that's what determines the rate and flow of the icing. So how do you make one of these babies? It is a bit like riding a bike, and some people are intimidated by it, but once you learn it, it becomes very, very rote. So let me show you what I've done. I've got a bunch here that I pre-made and stacked, which I often do before I start the decorating process. Now at this point, actually, before I move ahead, if you don't have the tools you need to do this, I would encourage you to pause the video, go grab a roll of parchment paper and a pair of scissors, because that's all you'll need, and follow along with me, because I find that as people do this, they learn how to do it much more speedily than if they simply watch someone do it. Okay, so now you can make a parchment cone out of pre-cut parchment triangles like these. These are available in most cake decorating and cookie supply houses, but they are a touch more expensive than working with rolled parchment paper. And I use rolled parchment paper for lining cookie sheets and other purposes in the kitchen, so why go out and buy two things when I don't really need to? Plus, there's some built-in curve to the parchment paper, as you can see. So if you work with that curve, it actually makes it a little bit easier to make the parchment cone. So the first step, and I do have an 8-photo sequence in Ultimate Cookies, that shows you how to do this as well, and I encourage you to reread that. But I do find that, again, if you follow along and watch somebody do it, I'll do it very slowly today, you'll learn that much more quickly. So the first step is to cut off as close to a perfect square as possible. If you cut off a perfect square, there's a litmus test at the end in my last step that indicates whether you've made it right, and it's just harder to apply that litmus test if you've cut off a rectangle or some other shape. And now what I'm going to do is cut that square along the diagonal so that you get actually 2 cones out of each square. We're just going to do one to start. The next step is to create the point of the cone. And beginners often think the point is going to come out of this particular corner of the cone, but in fact, it's forced out of the long side of the triangle. It's shaped out of the midpoint of the long side of the triangle. And to do that, as a first step, I just make a half cone like so. So I'm just kind of twisting in and forcing it into a half cone. So I have a nice sharp point there. And the 2 ends of my triangle are nicely aligned. That's what you're looking for at this point. Then I simply pick it up and I allow this free end. And here's where there's an advantage to the roll of the parchment paper, because the natural curve of it makes it easy to wrap this free end around the half cone that you've already created. Once I do that, I grab all the corners together. And I've got the basic shape of my cone here, so I'm not too far from done. But what you'll notice is that I've got a rather large hole in the tip of the cone, which is nothing I like. One of the advantages, which I didn't mention early on, of a parchment pastry cone is I have the ultimate flexibility with it. What I would like to do is close this up very, very tight so that when I actually get to decorating, I can cut it any width I want. And in fact, I can often cut it much, much smaller, or not cut it at all, than one of the smaller tips, metal tips that you find. So I can do some really fine decorating work with a parchment pastry cone that I can't do with a metal bag, and rather the bag and the metal pastry tip. Okay, so to close off that hole, what do? I'm holding the cone with the tip pointing up. So in this case, I would just pull down on the outer corner and maybe a little bit on the inner corner to shimmy that hole closed. And now you'll see that it's absolutely fully closed. But you want to keep this cone in place. Oh, first, let me talk about the litmus test. Now, if you did cut a perfect square to start, what you should find at this stage is that the 3 corners of the triangle are now roughly equidistant apart. I maybe didn't have a perfect square to start. They're about 1 inch to 2 inches apart for this size of parchment paper. I'm working with a 15-inch roll, which creates a cone that's about 7.5 to 8 inches long and 3.5 inches in diameter at the mouth. If you're more comfortable working with a smaller cone, just simply cut a smaller square to start. Or if you'd rather have your hand further away from the cookie and your work surface, then start with a bigger cone. But actually, as a beginner, I would recommend you start with a smaller cone and work closer to your work surface because you'll have a lot more control. This size happens to work very, very well for me, and it's slightly less bulky than a normal pastry bag with metal tip, which is, again, another reason I prefer to work with it. So how do I keep this in place? I simply fold these corners down to the outside so they don't interfere with getting the icing in the bag later, down to the same height as the rest of the cone. And then I want to cut a notch, or you can tear it, where all 3 corners intersect, and you'll see that's roughly dead center. And that'll hold it together, and especially when I stack them in advance of decorating like I often do. So we've got a cone made. If that wasn't clear to you, I'm going to show it again one time fast, and you can replay the video. Normally I wouldn't take that long making a cone. As I said, once you learn how to do it, it becomes relatively, very much so, I should say, second nature. So I've got another one made in a split second. Now, how to handle and pipe with this. I'm going to show you some quick tips. I've got it made. I'm just turning down a corner that was a little bit in the way. And I've got some royal icing made. I haven't talked about royal icing yet. It's my favorite decorating medium, and we will talk about it in the next video. But I've got some icing here that's thinned roughly to outlining consistency. It falls off the spoon in kind of slow blobs. And this is perfect for making thin lines, and I'm just going to show you how to do that. As you notice, when I filled that bag, I was holding the cone by the notch. If you don't, sometimes the weight of the icing will cause the cone to open up on itself, and you'll have kind of an icing disaster all over your counter. So always hold it by the notch. And I'm going to fill it for a cone of this size. Well, for a cone of any size, I would fill it roughly 1/2 to 2/3 of the way full. And for a cone of this size, that's about 1/4 cup to 1/2 cup of icing. You don't want to fill it all the way to the top because you need to create a grip at the top to handle the cone. Beginners will often just fold it down and start piping from here, but what happens is ultimately the icing squeezes out the sides of the bag, so you never want to do that. You actually want to start, and I'll turn the cone this way so it's easier to see, by folding in 2 corners, and this acts as kind of a seal and prevents that icing backflow. Then you want to roll it down taut, kind of like you would roll down a toothpaste, the bottom of a, roll up rather, the bottom of a toothpaste container, until the bag is taut and the grip is flush up against the top of the icing. So there it's filled, and just a few quick tips on how to pipe now that it's filled. Royal icing does dry very quickly, so you'll notice that when I'm not working with it, I immediately cover with plastic wrap so a crust doesn't form, and I'm going to do that and set that aside. We're just going to pipe here on my work surface, which I normally do before I decorate any cookie. I always like to test the flow of the icing on something other than a cookie so I don't waste a cookie. Now I, as you noticed, didn't cut any hole in the tip, and I've got a very, very thin line with almost an imperceptible hole, certainly smaller than the #1 pastry tip that's in this metal bag. So I've got a lot of control with this. If I want a bigger line, I simply cut across. Most often I'm cutting straight across. That'll give a nice rounded line, but if you cut it at a diagonal or some other angle, you'll get a different shape. More often than not, I want a well-rounded line, so I'll cut straight across. And then as far as piping tips, don't drag the tip on the surface of your work surface, you'll get something kind of rough and jagged. Instead, simply touch down to make contact with the surface, and then use the cone to guide the icing where you want it to go. You'll notice my tip is well off the work surface. Usually I hold it about 1/4 inch off the work surface or the cookie, and then touch down again to break the flow of the icing. That's basic piping technique, and we'll get into more advanced piping techniques in a later video. A couple of other notes before I conclude here. As you deplete icing, always roll down the top of the bag. You never want to kind of choke up in the middle of the bag. Beginners often do this, and what happens again, icing backflow, and you're actually constricting the flow of the icing out the tip. So that's a no-no. Instead, roll it down, make sure the bag's taut, and continue to pipe. You will also notice that my forefinger is on the bag. I am not pinching the middle of the bag. I'm simply using that as a steadying device. I'm actually standing right now. Normally I'd be sitting, so my hand's a little bit shaky, and that just helps me make sure I've got a nice, steady, kind of straight line. Okay, when you're done piping, let me show you how to clean out this bag. It's really very easy, and as I said, one of the primary advantages of a parchment pastry cone is you really actually don't have to clean it. I'm done with this particular task. We're ready to move on to the next video, but I've got a lot of extra icing in here that I don't want to just simply toss in the garbage. So what do? Snip off the tip, pump it back into the original bowl, and cover up the icing. As I said, it crusts very quickly. And then dispose of this bag. It certainly beats cleaning out a canvas or a plastic bag with a metal tip, and it's biodegradable. In our next video, I'll be talking about royal icing, my favorite decorating medium. Until then, live sweetly.